You can imagine the pleasure for me from a local boy who grew up in Delaware with no connection to Japan to be sitting in my hometown talking about Japan with a bunch of specialists, and especially with my friend Dave Plath. We were at Harvard at the same period, knew each other, and were going out to Japan roughly the same time, and we saw each other in Japan, and we've kept up ever since. So it's a wonderful opportunity to be in Delaware and reminisce. I'll say just a word about Delaware. As a kid growing up here, it didn't have a lot to do with Japan. In my day, it was a county seat of about 10,000 and a county of less than 30,000 that had a rural environment. The last couple decades, Columbus has grown so much that we've become a rich suburb of Columbus. And the south end of our town is where a lot of rich people from Columbus have moved, so the population has grown a lot. As looking back, I think there are two things I would say about Delaware and Japan that are somewhat different from the ordinary county town. Number one is that there were missionaries to Asia, people who graduated Ohio Wesleyan and went out to Asia, more to China, some to Korea, some to Japan, and came back. So some of their kids were in school, and some of the professors at Ohio Wesleyan had spent time. So there was a religious connection about Japan. The other thing I think that's unusual about this area now is the fact that Honda has factories less than 20 miles from here. And I'm happy to report that one of my PhD students, Rick Dyke, who after getting his PhD started teaching at Ohio State, was called upon by the governor of Ohio to go out and see if after Volkswagen decided to build their big factory in Pennsylvania instead of Ohio, see if he could rouse up some business. And so Rick Dyke was the go-between in setting up that Honda factory. And there's so many Japanese subsidiaries now nearby, and even people from, I have friends who've worked at that, old school friends who've worked at that factory, but it also had an impact in the Japanese being a greater presence in central Ohio than in some places because of the Honda factory. I don't think there are many influences I can trace from Delaware and Ohio Wesleyan to my Japan studies, but there is one old character who I call the Sage of Delaware, who was at the time the most popular professor at Ohio Wesleyan, who had an influence on how I approached studies in general. It was a guy named Roland Walker. In Ohio Wesleyan, old people in my generation all knew him because he was the most famous person in Ohio Wesleyan at the time, a Bible professor who wrote for a national Bible thing. He was also a favorite public speaker. By the time I was in high school, he'd already retired, but he was my high school graduation class speaker, and he was, more times than not, he was the high school graduation speaker. There are a couple things that he said that had a big impact on me. One is he said, when you write something, write it so the child could be interested and the challenge is a highbrow. So I've always decided in my writing that I would avoid jargon. As a graduate student and young faculty member, I went through a lot of theoretical concepts, but I always decided that I would want to write in a way that people could understand, and that I would try to tell stories that would communicate. Another thing I remember he said, he was describing somebody he knew, he said, he is so smart he can learn from anybody, which I thought was a great advice, that there are all kinds of people, and if you're really attentive, that they have something to say that you can learn from. Those attitudes have really had a deep impact. David and I decided that we'd start today describing my departure from Japan after 2 years living there the first time. I went there in 1958 with my wife and little kid, and we left on June 10th, 1960, and David Plath and his family went to see us off. That turned out to be a somewhat unusual day at the airport because Haggerty had arrived, and the Japanese student demonstration had engulfed the airport, so that the taxi that my wife and I were riding in could not go all the way to the airport. And we got stopped on the way by all these demonstrators. I were getting letters. You got some pictures, Dave, to show? So I was getting letters from my family, please stay off the streets in Tokyo, you're going to be in danger. And we didn't feel any danger. And we got to the airport. The cab stopped about 1,000 feet from the airport building because that's all the further it could go. And the demonstrators knew we were Americans, and they were very friendly and helpful to us personally. They were opposed to American Security Pact Treaty, Ampo Antai, and I had watched some of those demonstrations earlier, and they were really, on the streets yelling, and it was quite a demonstration. The demonstrations. I remember one student came to the United States to do comparative look at American students' demonstration. He says, "You guys are so unprepared. You don't have any shields to protect you. You don't have any gewabo." And for those of you who don't know 1960 Japanese, gewabo was from the German word gewalt, struggle, and bo was stick. So that was the big stick that the Japanese students held to defend themselves from the police. And you don't have any helmets, you don't have any gewabo, and how can you defend yourself? He wondered, about the American. But in any case, it was a very interesting situation where the Japanese at the airport, who were yelling against the American treaty, were friendly and clapping, and at one point we had to cross a fence, and they helped lift our little kid up over the fence, and they all clapped and cheered when we got over the fence. And these were the people who were demonstrating against the United States. Dave, why don't you take it from there?
Well, yeah, here in the midst of that mob scene that you see are these two young Americans sitting in a cab that can't move, of course. And I'm looking out the window, and there are guys being escorted to the back of the demonstration with blood streaming down their heads, and I'm thinking, and I remember I punched Ed. I said, "Ez, you've got a camera. Get out and get some pictures." I mean, this is the journalist in me. The big story is going to be where the demonstration is, but maybe we get a little sidebar for us. I don't remember whether we actually got out or not, but then this Japanese man apologized to us. And he said, "Oh, sorry, we're inconveniencing you. Do you need to go to the terminal?" and see, we had gone ahead with all the baggage. And we said, "Yeah, we've got all this baggage." Plus, Ez wanted to get there because he'd rented a VIP room for people who were going to see him off. So he was anxious to get there early. And the guy said, "Oh, that's all right. We'll carry your bags." And these guys carried our bags a quarter of a mile across the main runway into the terminal. And I've thought ever since that's a nice image for field work. If the people around you aren't going to carry your bags for you, you're not going to do very well. But I also want to just pick up on Ez's earlier comment on writing. As a journalist, I had a mentor. I'm this young cub reporter, not much experience. And after a couple of days, he turns to me and says, "Dave, what's your most important tool as a reporter?" And I'm sitting there at my desktop typewriter, and I said, "Well, the typewriter." He reached over to his desk, and he handed me a scissors. "That's your most important tool." Ez, why Japan? You had a research design that could have worked in any industrial country.
Well, as you know, when I was at Harvard, I think that I was in a department called Social Relations, where the idea was to link sociology, cultural anthropology, social psychology, clinical psychology, all in one, and make a new behavioral science. And we had grandiose notions of being the place that would create this new behavioral science. It never quite happened that way, but we had produced we attracted a lot of outstanding students. Those of you in social science may know the names of some of these people, Bob Della and Cliff Geertz, and Chuck Tilley and Neil Smeltzer. They were quite, attracted some very able social scientists in my generation. And when I was getting my PhD, one of my teachers, Florence Cluckhone, said to me, "You're so provincial. You've never been out of the United States. If you want to work on American society," and I was doing my PhD on American family with emotionally disturbed kids compared to American families with ordinary kids. She says, "You ought to go to another country." And I thought about it, talked to my wife, says, "Sure." So where would we go? Well, she said that one interesting place might be Japan, because in Japan they have a modern culture, a modern industry, relatively modern society, and yet a very different culture. So if you're trying to understand what difference culture make, it would be a very interesting choice. And there was another guy at Harvard at that time that Dave also knew, named Bill Cordell. He unfortunately died early, so he's not so well known, but he was an anthropologist who worked on mental health. And he said, "I'll be glad to introduce you and help you get a grant to go to Japan." So he did. And I had many lucky things, I would say, in my life, but one of them was that he found somebody who could rent a house not too far from the Langard School, where my wife and I were going to go for a year, in Shibuya. I called Naganuma. It wasn't a very good school, but it was the best that was going at the time. He said he had a friend in Japan who found a house right next door. The friend was Takeo Doi. And those of you who know about Japan at that time know that Takeo Doi was a very interesting psychiatrist who wrote a famous book called Amai no Kozo, the structure, I think it was translated as the anatomy of dependence. And he was a wonderful neighbor, and his wife was a wonderful neighbor. And so for the first year, we were primarily in language study, we would be next door to them. The place we had a lot of things to learn, not only about culture, but about how poor things. One day I went to the door, and Takeo was coming out with his coat on, and he said, "I was just going out." Later I found out he wasn't just going out. He couldn't afford, he was a psychiatrist, worked at a hospital, couldn't afford gas heat, and he was wearing a coat inside in order to save money. And in those days, people didn't have denki futatsu. That was too expensive. We didn't have electric stoves. We had dirt kitchen floors. We had in those days you could say jochu-san. Later that was, a maid, that was not the right way to put it. But in those days we were able to hire a maid, and we paid her 10,000 yen a month. And 360 yen to the dollar, that came to, about $70 or so. We paid her for a month. And then I remember at school, one of my teachers asked me in my elementary Japanese, asked me how much I paid for rent and how much I paid for the maid. And I said, well, for rent, we pay, I think it was 50,000 yen a month. It was, came to about $60, let's see, about $60. And he said, "Yappari gaijin dakara takai na to." He had to pay so much because in those days, I think I got $6,000 a year on my grant. And my wife and I saved money while we were in Japan because it would go so far and things were so inexpensive. The taxis in those days, there were three sizes, 60, 70, 80 yen. 80 yen was the big, heavy modern taxi, and the old little Datsun, 60 yen started out the taxi. So even as graduate students, we could live pretty well. I mean, people in 1958 were still poor, and I'm glad I got to go to Japan. We were still poor. I mean, so how did you get to Japan, Dave?
Well, let me step back for a minute. The general intent here is that we'll talk for maybe around 30 minutes, but then we really want to hear from the rest of you, how has this changed? The real theme of this talk is first field work, that unforgettable first kiss of virgin data.
Can I interrupt 1 second? When I say, I got to know Japan, I tell them that I had a miyai kekkon, not a renai kekkon. that I fell in love after, the marriage, not before.
Yeah. So, hope to hear from the rest of you. My getting to Japan was a little more complicated. I had actually spent a year in Japan as a naval officer stationed in a little radio station west of Yokohama. So I had some very broken Japanese, not very effective. And of course, when I get to Harvard, what was then called the Department of East Asian Languages was still old-style sinology. It was a documentary study. So there were no courses in spoken Japanese or Chinese. So when time finally comes for me to go, I decided I'm going to go to Japan. I wanted to go to China, but of course the PRC was totally closed. So I said, all right, I'll go back to Japan. But I said, I need language training. And they said, well, hire a tutor. I mean, like I'm got some independent income and I'm, the gentleman scholar of sinology or something. The problem I went back to Japan with was, to give it a label, leisure. And my argument, I know the latter-day histories of that period of intellectual interest in Japan, that period, all full of how awful it was we had these modernization bias, and that Japan was going to be forced to modernize like the West. I was looking at it the other way around. I thought, wow, maybe, because in the U.S. at that time there was a lot of concern about the way the changes in industry were going to put a lot of people out of work. Sound familiar? And the thought was, well, gee, they're going to have all this time to do other things. And so leisure was an intellectual theme at the time. And I thought, well, Japan has modernized on a different historical, cultural base. Maybe they can do it in a better way than we can. Anyway, that was the theme I went. Ended up living in 2 rented rooms in a farming village in Nagano, about half an hour from Matsumoto. And the reason I ended up there was, and this was the bias in anthropology at the time, anthropologists were supposed to study villages, not cities. My original proposal, which got shot down, I was going to stay in a city. They said, no, you've got to study villages. Well, the second proposal, I said, all right, I'm going to study an onsen village if I'm going to study leisure. And they said, that's not scholarship. You're just going to go and have fun. But my argument was, not only is this a main source of Japanese leisure activity at the time, you've got a captive audience. All these people who are there for several days probably glad to sit and talk to you for a while about their leisure activities. But that got shot down. And to Ed Reischauer's credit, they even phoned him and said, is this guy serious? This isn't... Ed stood up for me.
Good for him. My way of approaching the intellectual issue was quite different, because I had done my PhD thesis on American families that had emotionally disturbed kids and compared them with families that had normal kids. So that was the design I had for my research grant. And so after the 1 year in language school, I was able to get that built in because I didn't know any language when I went. You'd had a little bit. So we had the first year, my wife was psychiatric social worker, and I had a chance to go full-time to language school. The second year, we moved to a suburb, which we then called Mamachi, because we didn't want it known, and we wanted to preserve the privacy of the families. It's Ichikawa. It's in the Chiba, just across the border. So we moved in to that neighborhood. We moved there because the National Institute of Mental Health was located in that city. So we could pick up the families of emotionally disturbed children through the National Institutes of Health, and then we would find some normal families. We wanted the study, the way we did the study was to have really intensive interviews with the same families. So just as in the United States, we went to the same family every week. So my wife and I went to the same family for a year, and we talked to the same people over and over. We became really very deeply involved, and that time at the airport, the reason I rented the room was so those families could come and see us off. And even today, there's only, of the 6 housewives, only 1 is alive. Of the 6 men, they're all gone. But a lot of the children still, even in relation with our children, we kept up those families. They became kind of our Japanese families, and they were really one. It was tough. Later, we found out the way we got those families is that the National Institute of Health was doing some favor for a local school. They would see kids who had emotionally disturbed problems. So they got to the principal of the school and said, could you get 6 families in the school? So we didn't know this until later, but the principal said, okay, if you do this for the foreigners, you won't have to do PTA activities. You'll get out of your PTA responsibilities by seeing the foreigners. So we went every week, and they served us tea and okashi, some kind of thing. And we really got to know those families well and really liked them. And when I was nearing the end, well, maybe halfway into the year, I began to think, the difference between normal and abnormal families with normal and abnormal kids isn't all that great and wasn't that interesting, but I discovered something else. One time, one lady said, we salaried families are X, and those people who are business people are Y. And I began to think, and suddenly a lot of things began to fall in place. So I decided that the most interesting thing to write up was that structural difference between families that worked for large organizations and families that were independent or had to get their either independent farm families or local storekeepers and things like that. And there were several things that fit together. One is that to get your kid into a big organization, you had to pass entrance exams. And so the mothers were very focused in those salaried families on getting your kid. If you had your own store, it didn't matter much which high school or college you went to. But if you wanted to get your kid a good job, it was focused on getting an exam. And then you had regular hours and regular salary and long-term security. And they could begin to decide. In those days, when we first went, most families did not have television. But they could begin to think, if I save my bonus next year, I can make the down payment and maybe get the television, black and white, black and white Kuroshiro. They didn't have, color television was a little too expensive, but they maybe get, if they planned the things for the next year, and toasters had big covers on them to protect them from danger because they were so valuable, and similar things. It was a relatively poor life. That picture that I sent around, it shows my wife and me hosting 6 Japanese housewives, and I completely misunderstood. We thought when we invited those families, it was to thank them for our going there every week, and we would have a little celebration at our house. And they came, and my wife and I were so eager to show that we really lived completely Japanese style, tatami style, and that we had a separate bath, and the benjo was, the toilet was separate from the bath, and we had a niwa that, a garden that you could go out on and so forth. And we were so anxious to show that we had really adapted. And we later found that they were really disappointed. They were visiting an American family, and they told each other they wanted to see how Americans live. And it was a interesting kind of deeper message to us, and told us, something about the families that we were working with. That we wanted to go native and understand them, but a lot of them wanted to understand us too. And they felt, a lot of the mothers thought that they were preparing their kids for a world where the United States is going to be more influential, their kids are going to have to be more international. And they wanted to use the contact to understand how Americans raise their kids and how we manage things. And the kind of social science I was raised on by Florence Gluckone was, you're people. You relate. You don't try to stand aside, be objective. You tell them like you are, and you relate to them as real people. And then you try to sit back and say, okay, what was the nature of that relationship? But the idea of being so-called objective and scientific, was not the way we did it. We wanted to really know the people well, and they were real, and we were real, and we would act like we really were. They acted like they really were, and then we'd try to understand what they thought, and so one of the things we discovered is they were learning about the American and the international thing just as we were learning about them.
Yeah, let me step back a minute. This became Ezra's book, Japan's New Middle Class.
Right.
When I first read it, I was disappointed. I was disappointed. It was a great topic, and it was a timely one, because in American sociology, C. Wright Mills' White Collar had come out a few years before then, made a beautiful comparison. But I knew about all this very intensive family relationships that Ez and Sue had been studying, and there was none of that in there. And I thought, wow, why did you throw all that stuff away? But for obvious reasons, the protection of privacy and whatnot. I wrote out, and I'll pass this around. This is the appendix to
My book.
The Middle Class, and it tells you how he set up the study and went through it. I didn't do anything like that in my first writings, but the first ever byline I had writing about Japan, I had plenty of bylines as a cub reporter on the daily paper in the U.S., sort of summarizing what I've been finding after a few months, called Land of the Rising Sunday. And, titles are so important. Out of that first field work came my first book, The After Hours. And ever since then, when I would go to some other campus to give us talk, you knew whether or not your introducer had actually looked at the book. Because he'd say, oh, and Plath is this guy who wrote this book about Tokyo bar behavior. There's not a line in there about Tokyo bar behavior. And years later, I get a cold phone call, and it's a social worker in Los Angeles who says, well, you know all about Japanese bar behavior. Will you come do an intensive seminar with us about that? I said, well, I don't know anything about it. But anyway, well, why? Why are you asking me? Well, this was when, maybe 1980s, lots and lots of Japanese businessmen are in L.A., and the social work people are very concerned about sexually transmitted diseases. And so they thought, well, maybe if they could learn about Tokyo bar behavior, they could find the hostess bars in L.A. as a vector in the spread of STIs. The other title, and this was Bill Cordell and I, did a microsocial study of bedroom behavior not observational, but asking people about it in Japan.
Kawa. Kawa. In the river, you know.
Which I gave the title, Who Sleeps by Whom? And actually, it made a big splash in psychiatric circles because Freudianism at that time was still so dominant. And in Freudianism, you get this argument that if a child sleeps very long with a parent, it's going to do awful things to them in later life. And our point was, look, in Japan, actually blue-collar U.S. too, kids sleep with their parents for years. And there's no indication that the total Japanese population of adults is somehow wacko. That little article has been reprinted, cited, more times than all my other publications put together.
You know, the reason I jumped and said Kawa is, you know, the father and the mother and then the little kid in between the two parents. Of course, the book that I wrote that got attention was Japan is #1. And I wrote that in the late, I'd gone, you know, our oldest kid, you know, after his Japan experience, was having a little trouble in school, and we didn't want to take him out of school until he graduated high school. So we waited a few years. We went back in 75, 76. And when I spent that much time, I could see this place has really changed. And I felt that Japan was going to do very well. And as a sociologist, I wanted to make the point that they do a lot of things very well. They have a strong bureaucracy, they have a good educational system with a great deal of equality and so forth. The reason the book sold, of course, is people misunderstood what I was saying. They thought I was saying that Japan was economically going to pass the United States, and I didn't say that. And so, you know, over the years, there are different reactions. A lot of the people at first thought, that I'd spent too much time out there and gone a little crazy and overemphasizing how well they were doing. And then 10 years later, when Japan was going like this, he really could foresee, you know, what Japan was going to do. And then now the reporters come by, why did you make a mistake, you know, Professor Vogel, that turned out that they didn't really turn out to be #1. My point was that in social structure, they had done a lot of things very well. And so somehow that when I was trying to interview some company executives, and before the book came out, I would call up and I would talk to the secretary, and the secretary would say, what do you want to do? And I'd say, well, I'd like to interview the guy. And then he would say, what is it exactly? Would you write it out for us? And send me a letter. So I'd write it out and send him a letter. And then they'd call back, well, just a minute, I haven't had a chance to. About 2 weeks later, the guy would see me for half an hour. After the book came out, I would call up and say, Vogel sensei desu ka? And then they'd say, sakana ga suki ka, niku ga suki, dochi ga ii kana? They were ready to take me out to meal. Yeah. And I was treated completely different because I was now a famous scholar. So in a way, I was happy that I had been an unknown scholar, you know, until I was about 50, because that was the real me. And I'm afraid that if I had become so famous early, you know, I might have, I would have, you know, got carried away with the fame. But I like to think that I'm still me, you know, because I didn't get famous until late in my career. But I've had the good fortune of being able to go to Japan every year, at least once a year since that time, and so to keep up with what's happening in Japan. And now that I've worked on China, as some of you know too, and what I feel about Japanese is they don't have to worry about the political climate. I have a lot of good Chinese friends, and I like working with them, but if the political climate gets tight, you know, they have to behave in a somewhat different way. I never feel that way about my Japanese colleagues. I always feel that they're just as they always were, and they've proved to be very loyal, good friends. I mean, I think we're lucky to work on a country that has such good friends and where they are loyal and straightforward, so it's been a real joy to continue to follow the families that we knew over a long period of time. And those of you who are young and getting started at a place, I suggest you try to keep in touch with that place, because to see what happens with a place you knew well over the years, you have a basis for understanding and maybe a second or third book that could come out describing and keeping in touch with those people. I strongly recommend that.
Well, just one comment, and then let's open it up. I never became famous, but I did get acquainted with, in later years, with a number of Japanese businessmen. They finally took me to Tokyo bars, so I did have some. But look, ask questions if you want. I'd rather hear from you. A lot of you weren't even born when we did our first field work. How has first field work in Japan changed? Anybody?
Or ask us questions as you wish, or comments, or... Okay.
Yeah.
If I may ask a kind of China-related question, Professor Vogel. I know you published Deng Xiaoping, and that's so well received and very famous. Both Chinese leaders and scholars cite and so forth. Now, of course, with Xi Jinping eliminated the term limit for the presidency in China and so forth. So I wonder what your view is about their claim of 无忘初心. 无忘初心 meaning we'll never forget about our initial mission of Chinese Communist Party. Well, or Marxism, orthodox Marxism. But on the other hand, of course, you have private ownership, private businesses, and even capitalists are allowed to join the party now. So clearly there is a conflict, and there is a self-contradiction in there. So, but China's economy has grown so much, nobody cares about that. For someone like me living in this country, of course I care very much about the development. But we also want to know whether, sometimes they talk about the direction of the country and so forth. So I wonder whether you have comment on the 无忘初心. Have they forgot about their initial mission when they, for example, took power in 1949? Or they actually abandoning that and only keep the power again?
First of all, because I care about both China and Japan, I have friends in both places. I want the two countries to get along. The last few years, I've been working on a book on the history of relations between China and Japan. I finally just finished that. It'll come out in June. And if the book gets published in China, as I hope, I'll go lecture there, and I'll lecture in Japan about the book. And what's happening in China, my quick answer is that society has changed so much in China. The fact that when I fortunately, I first went there when people were really poor. And we visited parts of China where people had basically no clothes on, and they were skinny because they didn't have enough to eat. And we know that a lot of millions died during the Great Leap Forward from lack of food. And I think Deng Xiaoping, when I retired from Harvard, I tried to think about what were the biggest changes in Asia as a scholar who wanted to try to play my role in informing the American public and what was going on in Asia. I felt the biggest thing to report is the changes that came from the new policies that Deng introduced. And so I feel that the policies introduced in '78 completely changed China. And as you know, from one who benefited from the examinations of reopening the universities, the Chinese now when Deng came to power, there were basically no students studying abroad. Now there are about 1.5 million Chinese studying abroad, over 300,000, about 350,000 in the United States, and just the information, the understanding of the outside world. And you know, for a while, as you know, that they were afraid to have any enterprise that had more than 7 employees. Now they have big private companies, and the companies are involved around the world. So it's completely changed, and the structure is completely changed. I think that the Chinese leaders who look at what happened in the Soviet Union when private companies became strong and the place fell apart is something that worries them a lot. And they're trying, I think that Xi Jinping, I don't think he's as strong as some Western observers believe. I think he's really very worried about what could happen in China, and he's trying to tighten up. And I think there's a lot of reaction against that from officials in China who are worried. I think that a lot of intellectuals feel they're not given the space to have the freedom to have discussions they would like to, and yet they know that they have to be cautious in what they say publicly. So I think now you see new slogans to try to tighten things up, and you see people behaving cautiously, but I don't think that's the end of history. I think that that there are just too many people too involved in the outside world to have the tight control over information and the tight control over ideas that this Xi Jinping would like to have. That's my personal, that's my, but that's a little off the topic, so I'm sorry. Yeah.
Different topic, and I'm realizing now I probably should have defined earlier what I mean by fieldwork. Now, you know, sociologists, anthropologists, we like to go out and do sumikomi chosa, settle down in some community for a long period of time. But from my perspective, most of you have done field work of some sort. Even if your study is a library study about Murasaki Shikibu, you get out and look at where she's writing about, you know, you get out and talk with other Japanese about there. So everybody's done first field work as far as I'm concerned. I want to hear about what first field work is like, because most of you went far better prepared than either Ezra or I were. We both had problems with the Japanese language. Ezra was much better. When I arrived a few months later, I envied him because he'd had this several months of intensive.
But you could read better than I could.
Well, yeah. At one time, finally, I thought, if we were out among Japanese, I always hung behind him and let him handle the interaction. But I realized I could read reasonably well without a dictionary for nonfiction Japanese newspapers. And one day we're riding the Tokaido Honsen in Tokyo, and we're heading west. I've forgotten where we were going. We get somewhere around Shinagawa, and there's this big factory building there. And Ezra, who's studying kanji, says there's this green legend up there that says Anzen Daiichi. And he turns to me and says, "Gee, that must be a big corporation. I see that sign all over Japan."
That's how bad I was.
Come on.
Here's the question. So you offered as a piece of advice for anybody going to Japan, certainly a new scholar, to take advantage of the opportunity to get to know people,
Yeah.
which certainly enhances, makes richer living in Japan, whether or not that is a particular aspect of the field work. But thinking of all the graduate students you've advised over the course of your careers, you're looking at a 60-plus year engagement with Japan. How has the advice that you've given Japanese students going off to do field work, or younger scholars, maybe going to do the second book, how has that advice changed over time, and what else might you advise at this point?
Well, it's not so much advice. the watershed for me came around 1990 when I realized that graduate students who were coming to work with me already had far better language preparation, had already had been in Japan for a while than I had when I got back from my first field work. Not only did they have good language preparation, they had been inside of Japanese organizations, which in our era was impossible. You could not be inside a Japanese corporation except as, oh, you're our English translator. You could not have a role with enough power that you could do damage to the organization. So, you know, since 1990, the students I've sent are so much better prepared, and they've seen the inside, the dark side of Japanese organizations, and they're still going back.
Well, I think that, you know, the JET program, how many people
Yes,
I know
yes,
who are
yes.
of my generation
Yes.
who got to know Japan maybe through study abroad in college, but then afterwards, the extent to which that
Yeah.
really has become a crucial kind of entree point.
I think it's a huge difference between what we know and what we knew when we started our field work and what students know nowadays. I mean, there were so few books out, you know, on Japanese society. Rondor, I fortunately met just before I went my field work, and he gave me a copy of City Life in Japan, which is about to come out. It wasn't yet printed, and he gave me a manuscript that I read, and you know, when I read through it, I thought, wow, I learned so much. And then I thought, oh my God, what else is there left to do after he did that? And how can I? And now, you know, the new scholar, you know, faces 300 books on Japan. I don't know how many there are, but you know, it's a mountain of good studies by good people. And how do you establish yourself now? I mean, and in a way, it was sort of fun learning a lot of these basics that we thought on a broad canvas. And now I think it almost requires the person to be more specialized. But I hope what I try to encourage my students to do is while they're doing a specialized topic, think big. I mean, how does that relate to the broader issues? And sure, you want to make your own independent contribution, you do something special, but I think it would be more valuable and you'll be more satisfied and more interesting if you could see how your topic is related to border issues. That's what I try to tell my students.
Well, I was glad earlier when you commented on somebody's paper. You know, speculate.
Don't be
Give some
afraid.
big ideas. You don't have to document everything exactly.
And you don't have to be wild. I mean, you can think systematically. And what I do when I'm working on something, I write down some ideas, and then 2 weeks later I look at it again and revise it, and then 3 weeks later I reorganize it. And but as you think things through, what my experience has been, as you think things through, you know, that process of thinking how's this related to that, and what did it have to do with this, and what that process in writing a book or preparing is really a great process. And and when you get through, you can talk more broadly than when you started out, not just about your own special topic. I guess time is up.
We could go on, but I think we've used up our time.
Yeah.
Dan?
Maybe one more comment.
Fine. Yeah.
Mine's a question. I'm sorry. I'm interested in your experience as scholars over time. It seems to me when you would have landed back in the U.S., starting your careers in academia, you were, as far as Japan goes, you were pretty well ahead of the curve at that point. And I'm wondering about how you were received, right? Did people look at your work and say, oh, this is interesting work for, you know, whatever kind of thing you were doing, or did they say, why in the world you're wasting time on Japan, or, you know, how did they react? And then the long arc of that, how does that evolve? Where's the point where suddenly people are calling you on the phone saying, oh gosh, here's somebody who knows about Japan, and he can probably help us. And I wonder if you can talk about that evolution.
I suspect Ez's got a lot more of those kind of phone calls than I did.
Well, I started out, but you please add. I think when I was starting, there were certain kind of people like Marius Jansen and John Hall and Ed Reischauer who were trying to build fields of Japanese studies, and they wanted people from different disciplines. So they, I think, gave us encouragement and tried to help universities. And I think when Japanese companies started coming to the United States, they wanted good relations with the local people, and they were often quite generous with universities and grants in various places. So, you know, when Japan is, I've traveled and lectured, so you go to Nebraska, and Kawasaki went there, and, you know, they built some things in Georgia, you know, when YKK, you know, went there. So I think throughout the United States, we've benefited from the combination of certain far-sighted senior Japan specialists who wanted to broaden out the part of training in different aspects of Japan, and the generosity of Japan. I think that generosity is no longer as great as it was. And I think we're lucky that there are a lot of endowments so that places can keep going. But it's harder to get new money now, and it's just more difficult. And I think you have to respond to changing demand. And I still have a number of former students in Japan who were there who went in the 80s who really wanted to go into business, and they learned about Japan, and they did very well, and some of them married Japanese women and settled and did very well. But now the students, you know, then they go into anime or sports or something, but there aren't many who decide to go to Japan because that's a good promising place to make money. So there is changing demand that the university has to adapt to, you know, in terms of the courses they teach and how they teach, depending on what's going on at the time. But I've been very pleased that there are still ways to make Japan interesting, and there's still audiences out there that if you find the right niche and the right way of doing it, there's still, even though you're not going to go out there to, you know, start a business the way you were in the 80s, that there's still a lot of things that makes Japan attractive, and you have to adapt to that.
Oh, yeah. Two comments, one in the small and one in the larger. Actually, Ez was well employed. Around 1960, for a graduate student in anthropology, it was about like now. There just were not that many jobs. You grabbed whatever you could. Then along came Sputnik and Ford Foundation and federal money. And all of a sudden, around 1963, for about 5 years, it was a golden age. Jobs came chasing you. My favorite one over all the letters I would get was from a Baptist college, I will not name it, that said, "We want you to come and develop a Japan program for us." And I said, "But I'm not a Baptist." They said, "Well, that's okay. You don't have to be a Baptist, but we do expect you to go to the church of your choice every Sunday." On the larger scale, something was going on, though, in the 1960s that is no longer there. And that is that I mentioned earlier the dean who hired me, who had been on the USS Missouri. In university administrations and in other faculties, there were lots of guys who had been in the war and had a real interest in Japan and helping Americans understand Japan better. So you could draw on that. There was that climate, not just climate of interest, but climate of influential people who you could go to, and they would help you build programs. And that's not on campus anymore that I know of. Maybe for China now, but.
Right. Susan wanted to-
Yeah, I just wanted to add in more recent history that when American money for Japanese studies was decreasing, we got the Japan Foundation. And every one of us here has hugely benefited from that. Even if you never had like an individual grant, you're here. And I know, at least for me, I would not have had a career in Japanese studies if it weren't for MJS. So I am grateful that that exists, and even for students, student interest, I'm talking undergrads because that's all I taught, but their interests, now their interest comes from anime and video games, but before that it was martial arts, and before that it was, something else. And so students' interest in the field has been different over time, but there's always been people who are interested in Japan, and the question is, are there jobs and is there funding for graduate work? And, I think that's the big sort of question that we're facing.
Unfortunately, I think there are not that many really good jobs on Japanese studies now. So, all the instincts of us in the 60s, and let's get more students. And then I think now we have to be somewhat more restrained, and we have to be as honest as we can about the prospects, what they really are. And there just aren't that many great jobs, and you have to combine something else.
I'd like to add this is my observation, that when David and Ezra finished, Ezra was in sociology, so maybe, but in anthropology, that's not anthropology, to study a modern, complex culture. That's what he got.
That was a little part of anthropology. Lloyd Warner and a few others. It was a little.
The general idea was that it wasn't legitimate anthropology. Now that's
Except that at Harvard, I think probably at Columbia, and at Chicago with Robert Redfield and Milton Singer. There were at least 3 major universities where, fine. My mentor said, of course you want to go study a place like Japan. One of my mentors, an overstatement, but he was making a point. Look, there's more diversity within a place like Japan than there is in all the tribal societies across the world. And I think, there's something there. There's a tremendous diversity within Japan.
I think this is a good time to end because it's 6:15 in the reservation.
Yeah.
The restaurant is 6:30, but we can continue talking over more wine.
Well, and I want to thank you for putting up with all my demands. This started. This started out just as something fun for me and Ezra to do. It didn't, and then it mushroomed into this formal activity.
Thank you. So we'll continue.